Hello and welcome to the KPI Institute's webinar, Managing Performance in the Public Sector, Lessons Learned. My name is Andrei Kostia and I will be your host for today along with our presenters Mihai Toma and Teodora Gorski. This webinar is part of a series of free educational materials that aim to enhance the knowledge and know-how of those interested, while also creating a bridge between us as a company and you, our public. The KPI Institute is a research organization specialized in business performance. It operates research programs in 12 practice domains, each linked to a certification course ranging from strategy and KPIs to employee performance, and from customer service to innovation performance. The KPI Institute continuously builds on its values of best know-how, data and facts, and common sense to achieve its mission of integrating performance as a discipline through research, publications, and, what interests us today, through educational programs such as this webinar. Today, 13 years after the KPI Institute was created, we can proudly say that our products have reached professionals in 5 continents and that our public comprises a worldwide community of 73,000 members online and 28,000 registered companies on smartkpis.com. Today's webinar presents an overview of the lessons learned from deploying performance management systems in public sector institutions and a review of the literature on this topic, and it will be delivered by Mihai Toma and Teodora Gorski. Mihai Toma is the head of professional practice at the KPI Institute, the Middle East and North Africa branch. His research activity in the performance management field has resulted in the documentation and revision of over 1,000 key performance indicators. Teodora Gorski is the Managing Director at the KPI Institute, Middle East and North Africa branch, as well as a project management expert with experience in research, organizational development, and human resources. As Managing Director, Teodora has led numerous organizational development initiatives that supported and enhanced the organization's strategic plan and has been managing the development and growth of the Middle East and North Africa branch of the KPI Institute. This presentation lasts for approximately 30 to 45 minutes. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have during the webinar, as they will be answered at the end of the presentation in our Q&A session. Enjoy the KPI Institute's webinar, Managing Performance in the Public Sector, Lessons Learned. Now I would like to invite Mihai and Teodora to begin their presentation.
Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I want to present to you the topics that we will be discussing for today's webinar. We're going to start with the importance of planning and communication in the public sector. Afterwards, we're going to have a look at how can we use performance management maturity audits in order to look at the maturity of our performance management systems. Followed by that, we want to see what is the sound performance management architecture that public organizations might be using in practice. Followed by the fourth session around objective and KPI selection. How do we actually track the performance of our organizations by using objectives and KPIs? And last, how do we align the framework across the public sector? Some of the learning objectives for today will be to try to identify what are the main challenges in managing performance in the public sector. How are we going to build an integrated and robust performance management system that will help us in tracking the performance of our entities? We will try to understand why is it important to link objectives and KPIs across an entity, and how can we enhance strategy planning and communication in the public sector in order to be able to transmit what we want to achieve. During this presentation, we'll also have a look on some case studies from practice different organizations and how they apply these learning objectives and how they apply good case practices that we can all learn from. We are going to start with our first point in terms of importance of planning and communication. So, as we all might know, in 2015, the United Nations have developed the Sustainable Development Goals, or in short, the SDGs, also known as the Global Goals, which are a universal call to action in order to end poverty, protect the planet, and basically ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. Now, these 70 Sustainable Development Goals also have 169 targets, which demonstrate the scale of this universal agenda. Now, the agenda is clustered on three dimensions: the economic, the social, and the environmental. Now, goals and targets that will stimulate action over the next 15 years, so up to 2030, have been identified in some critical areas of importance that we want to shortly cover. First of all, we have the people. So how can we ensure prosperity for our people? By ending the poverty and hunger and ensuring that all human beings are able to fulfill their potential. We also need to ensure that our planet is protected through sustainable consumption and production, through sustainably managing our national resources, and by taking actions on climate change. We also need to ensure peace and foster peaceful and inclusive societies which are free of fear and free of violence. We need to ensure that we have prosperity and that all human beings across the globe can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives. We need to ensure that in terms of economic, social, and technological, we are countries that ensure progress in these topics. Last but not least, in order to ensure that all of these SDGs can be achieved, there needs to be a partnership in place and to encourage cooperation and global solidarity. Now, what has happened since the launch in 2015 of the SDGs is the fact that these SDGs have been adopted by countries by setting long-term visions and aspirations for the people in their countries and for the countries themselves. So we have examples of the UAE 2021 vision, Saudi Arabia 2030 vision, Oman 2040 vision, or Egypt 2030 vision. What these basically describe is the kind of life that people want to live and how the country will look in the future. This long-term vision basically are like a destinations that will answer the question, where do we want to be as a country? So we want to have a look at some early adopters of these country visions and the countries that have moved towards committing to achievement of the SDGs and what we can learn from these early adopters. We're going to talk about four key lessons that we can learn and adopt in our entities from these early adopters. First, we need to ensure that we evaluate and align the strategies that we have as countries. Now, government, they need to review their own national priorities and plans and need to ensure that these are correlated to the global goals and the global targets. Now, one good case practice is the UAE, United Arab Emirates, where the Abu Dhabi Economic Vision of 2030 appears to very nicely follow the SDGs, given the priorities that we have seen. So what we can see that in terms of the SDG of good health and well-being, the UAE government ensures that by offering a cohesive society and a world-class healthcare. In order to ensure peace and justice, we can see that as part of the strategy of the country, they are ensuring a safe and fair justice system. In terms of decent work and economic growth, we might see that the UAE focuses on a competitive knowledge economy, while also ensuring quality education through a first-rate education system, and ensuring, last but not least, that sustainable cities and communities are addressed by sustainable environment and a sustainable infrastructure that is created in these countries. Second, as part of some of the lessons learned, is to make sure that we integrate economic, social, and environmental decision-making into our policies. Now, what we can see is that countries are trying to diversify their economies. So By making decision and using a set of objective sustainable development criteria, the UAE economic vision, as we can see in this slide, aims to boost non-oil revenues, increase access to capital, and promote the GDP of SMEs, and also reducing vulnerability. Basically, they are launching initiatives in order to make sure that they can diversify their revenues and move from a nation that is based on revenue from oil towards diversifying their incomes by foreign investment, by bringing more tourists to the country, by looking at how competitive they are at the global level. Third, we need to ensure that we plan and retain the SDGs core principles of inclusion. Now, the SDGs have been built on the fact that all countries can contribute and receive help because we are living in this interconnected world. Now, because the SDGs framework demands action to be taken by all, ownership needs to be given to a variety of stakeholders because it is crucial to achieve this shared prosperity. Now, one important aspect, or let's say component, to be taken into consideration is the fact that participation of all stakeholders needs to be ensured. And when we talk about stakeholders, we talk about our governments, our semi-government institutions, the private sector, and ordinary citizens, so that we can make sure that these people are taking ownership of the national agendas, and as a country we are able to move forward. And on the screen we can see, in terms of the Dubai Plan 2021, how they have planned as well as involved people and different stakeholders in terms of planning and executing the launch of the Dubai Plan 2021, which is aligned to the UAE vision of 2021. Fourth, but not least important, is the fact that in order to make sure that we are achieving our vision as a nation, as a country, as governments, or as entities in general, ensuring communication is a vital factor. Now, communication is important because it ensures basically that our stakeholders, they understand the direction in which we want the country to be moving. It also ensures that our stakeholders, our citizens, they are kept informed, they are persuaded in regards to different initiatives that we want to take, as well as they are engaged at all times. What it basically leads to is more effectiveness because we are building support from the public for these programs. It ensures that we as governments are accountable because we set our objectives and we set our KPIs, and our citizens can make us accountable of what we promise to deliver, as well as we are more responsive as government. Why? Because we know and are aware of the citizens' need and we can respond to them. Now, one good case practice, again from the government of the United Arab Emirates, is the fact that they have launched the National Program for Government Communication, where the government of the UAE is communicating to the public their progress towards ensuring that they meet the national strategy for 2021. Our second point of discussions, after planning and ensuring communication, is the importance of having a performance management maturity system audit. Now, what is this performance management system maturity model and audit? Well, it's basically a framework that was developed across the years by the KPI Institute. How does it work is we look at organizations and how mature they are in terms of the tools and practices they use in terms of performance management system. Now, the maturity model is based on 3 clusters that are taking place. First, we have a self-assessment maturity survey. Now, what does this self-assessment maturity survey consist of? It's basically some statements and best practices which are distributed to several stakeholders within the organization. Each statement is rated on a scale from 1 to 5 based on the extent to which the statement applies in the organization. After we are launching the survey for the self-assessment, we also have a look at the internal documentation. Basically, we are reviewing key documents related to performance management. Now, when we talk about key documents and key terminology, we are talking about looking at the way organizations set their vision, their mission, their value drivers, their strategic objectives, what are the techniques that they are using in terms of strategy planning, how organizational, departmental, or individual KPIs look like. Similar to the self-assessment, the analysis is done by rating on a scale from 1 to 5 the existence and the characteristics of these tools. Last but not least, we also conduct interviews with key stakeholders. Now, the interviews are basically conducted in order to ensure a better understanding of the survey findings and clarify any aspects that are related to the documents that have been submitted for analysis. Basically, sometimes what happens is that self-assessment of the people as well as internal documentation analysis, we can see that the results are very different. So because of the high variations, sometimes as part of the interviews, we want to touch base on this particular statements. Now, why does it help an organization to measure the maturity of a performance management system? Well, basically, we want to ensure that we as organizations are using the right tools and the right processes. It also helps us in identifying what are the weaknesses of our current performance management frameworks, and it ensures that we get the maximum value from our performance management systems. Sometimes by identifying these areas of underperformance, it helps us in justifying investment in different process improvement. Now, one case study that I would like to talk about comes from the UAE and from the Financial Audit Department. It's basically the supreme audit institution in the UAE. Its scope is to audit in terms of financial performance and compliance, all government departments in Dubai, all public corporations and companies where the government holds more than 25% of the shares. Now, in their scope, there are around 300 entities. Now, in terms of the context that has been created there is the fact that customized performance management maturity model has been developed, which was customized based on some of the challenges that were identified by the organization. The fact that because of a low expected response rate from participants in the government, they moved towards an evidence-based approach, meaning rather than submitting surveys for people in government organizations to rate the maturity of their performance management model, they were just evaluating based on evidence, based on documents. Also, the model was customized in order to make sure that the system is integrated with the framework of the financial audit, because as we've seen, the scope of the financial audit department is not only to evaluate performance, but also to evaluate financial performance and compliance. So this maturity model needed to be integrated with the framework for FAD and to create a clear assessment guidance in terms of what needs to be done. Now, some of the steps that they have in terms of ensuring that the program is rolled out across the 300 organizations is related to, first of all, communication and creating induction sessions with the targeted organizations in order to ensure that these organizations understand the scope of the performance management maturity model assessment. Initiating the progress by submitting to the organization the methodology for the maturity assessments together with the requirements, looking at the documents, but also conducting client visits in order to conduct interview and review performance management documents that have been received from entities, ensuring that data analysis is made, and based on the data analysis, output is generated in terms of maturity assessment findings, which are visually represented into a performance plan. Maturity assessment result presentation, meaning that they would meet with client organizations, with their stakeholders, the 300 organizations within the Dubai government, in order to ensure that they present the results of the maturity assessment findings, as well as offering them recommendations for improvement. Now, the final output of the project has been the fact that 80 auditors have been trained on the maturity model assessment, and a methodology has been created in order to, let's say, analyze the maturity based on evidence. Now, the 4 clusters that organizations in terms of maturity will be evaluated within the UAE government are based on strategy planning maturity. So how mature are organizations in terms of their strategy formulations, in terms of their strategy focus and strategy execution? How well are they doing their KPI selection, documentation, and target setting? How structured are they in gathering the data as well as making it visual? In terms of performance management, how do they do data analysis, or how do they utilize the data that they have from their KPIs? How do they utilize this data in order to create reporting and take better decisions, as well as how do they align their projects and initiatives to the objectives that they have as organization? And last pillar, because we talked about the importance of cascading across the organization, how mature are organizations in terms of managing employee performance, in terms of planning for performance, measuring and reviewing performance, and last but not least, linking the employee performance to the performance management recognition. Now, for the public sector performance management architecture, I would like to have my colleague Mihai tell you a bit in terms of the public sector. What is the performance management system architecture that is recommended and that we've seen in practice, and we can say it is a good case practice?
Hello everyone, my name is Mihai, and I will be your guide for our last 3 topics that we're going to cover. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank my colleagues that helped us up until this point. So let's start in talking about how the architecture of a performance management system can look like in a public sector entity. Now, to make this a bit more practical, we're going to start off with a discussion around a case study. And this is a project that we've been involved in the past few years. We work with the Abu Dhabi Retirement Pensions and Benefit Fund to help them basically redesign their entire performance management system. Now, just as a bit of background, the Abu Dhabi Pension Fund is responsible for managing the contributions, pensions, and the service benefits for all UAE nationals who either work or have retired from government institutions. Now, we've developed their architecture, let's say in around, 3 years on and off. We're going to take a look at what were the main challenges that they face, because I'm sure that this apply to a lot of entities, even if they're not public sector. So, in terms of challenges, one of the main ones was providing top management with clarity in terms of how the actual fund is performing. And for this part, we needed to find the right KPIs to measure their performance. Additionally, we wanted to create a holistic performance management system that allows, let's say, a clear overview about how we are performing across all different levels. And one of the main roles of this performance management system is to reduce subjectivity, not just in employee performance evaluations, but in assessing performance overall. And last but not least, the important part was to also make sure that we get buy-in for using this entire system, especially the KPIs at all organization levels. So how did we go about this? We had 4 main phases in the project. First and foremost, we started at the top level. So let's say entity level. We wanted to see what's their current strategy, review that strategy, and based on our strategy, revamp the entire management system. Now, once that was done, we moved on to the operational level, where we aligned basically how each department contributes to the overall fund's objectives. This was also corroborated with an education and communications campaign, and I'll show you a bit later one of the, or a few of the tools that we've developed in order to help with the communication part. And lastly, we try to link everything by going even to the individual level. Now, in terms of the architecture itself, because this is the main topic of this this particular session, this is how we see the architecture in any type of entity, be it public sector or private sector. The idea is that you start off with a strategy, meaning what do you want to achieve, what do you want to do as an organization, and that will be developed in a strategic plan. Based on a strategic plan, then we're going to set up a strategy map which includes all of our objectives. Once we have the objectives, we start to select KPIs to measure their achievement, and that is clustered in a scorecard. The scorecard is complemented by a dashboard if we move to the more, let's say, operational day-to-day stuff. So we have the large picture and the day-to-day performance measured as well. And everything is interlinked with the initiatives, because these are the actions that we actually take in order to achieve our objectives. And this is then cascaded across the organization. So I'm going to show you exactly what was done in terms of, let's say, objectives and KPIs. So this is an overview of the scorecards that were developed. So starting from the corporate level and how these were cascaded across the different departments in the Abu Dhabi pension fund. And the same thing applied for the dashboard part. Now, just to show you a bit, let's say, or to give you a visual aid about how these tools look like, this is basically a strategy map, what we have here in front of us. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this tool. It was developed as part of the balanced scorecard methodology, and it basically involves grouping all of our objectives in, traditionally it's 4 balanced scorecard perspectives, but nowadays we've seen a lot of public sector entities and also private companies that they're basically adjusting these perspectives to make them more specific to their own line of work. And this is basically a good practice. The idea is, or the main point is that we cluster, we group these objectives based on similar characteristics, and the strategy map as a tool also helps us in identifying these cause and effect relationships, as you can see from the arrows that connect these objectives. Now, once we have the objectives established, the next step is to create our performance scorecard. And this is one of the main tools that entities use to evaluate the performance, because this is where we add the KPIs, as you can see here, to measure our objectives. We'll talk a bit more about how we actually set objectives and KPIs in the following session. So I'm just gonna jump across to the dashboard part, which is another of the important tools that we need to develop as part of the entire architecture, because this tool provides us with a visual overview of how we are performing in terms of the more operational activity. So these two tools, the dashboard and the scorecard, complement one another. Now, because I mentioned the strategy and communication part, and it's linked with what my colleague Theodora mentioned earlier, for this particular project, these were the 3 main outputs that we've developed to help the Abu Dhabi Pension Fund communicate what they're trying to achieve. So we've developed a set of posters, which were their printed strategy maps, posted them across the office so everyone understands what the company wants to do. We've developed a set of 11 video doodles, which are both available in English and in Arabic on their YouTube channel, if you're curious to check them out, which again had the purpose of trying to transmit the message and the importance of what they were trying to do. And last but not least, we created a performance management system manual, and this is basically a guidebook that employees can check to see exactly how the entire system was developed, what were the techniques used, and how they can replicate this process in the future in case changes are required. Now, we're going to move on to session number 4, and this is very much linked with what we discussed earlier, as well as our last topic that we're going to discuss. Everything goes very well hand in hand in terms of objective setting and KPI selection, because these are, let's say, some or two of the important parts or tools that we are going to use whenever we manage our performance. Here, we're going to take a look again at a few examples from practice and then at the case study. So my colleague Todora mentioned earlier about the Saudi Vision 2030. Now, as part of this, let's say, government-wide initiative, something that they've done is created the National Transformation Program, which is basically trying to move performance up to 2020. So they're trying to break the Vision 2030 down into 5-year bulks, and in each 5-year, they're going to have different targets which are ultimately linked with the Vision 2030. So as you can see from this slide, once they've identified that they have a challenge, which is that a lot of citizens have difficulty in obtaining suitable housing funding financing. So they're not able to get loans in order to purchase homes. So they set an objective based on this challenge, and this objective was to enable citizens to obtain suitable housing financing. And once we have the objectives, then we start off by selecting the KPIs, which we see here on the right-hand side, and their main role is to show us how and if we are achieving our objective. This is also applicable for the UAE national government. So as we've seen, they have the Vision 2021. You can see the source here on the bottom part of the screen. If you click on that source, or if you go to that link, you're going to see all UAE national key performance indicators. So this is again an example of how they've chosen the KPIs based on their particular clusters, and also it's linked with the communication part, the fact that they're trying to make this public, to make let's say the citizens of the UAE aware of how the government is performing in achieving its goals and objectives. Now, in terms of the case study for this topic, we're going to take a look at the Ajman Executive Council, which is basically the government authority in charge with administrating Ajman, which is one of the 7 emirates in the UAE. Now, one of their main problems that they've had after they've aligned their emirate strategy to the UAE national strategy was the fact that they didn't have a clear picture of how they're actually performing. So one of their main challenges was finding the right KPIs to measure their strategic directions. Once that was done, they had to set the right targets for the KPI, start the activation process, and very importantly, motivate and engage staff to rely on KPIs in their management activities. So we had a very structured approach when we set out to select the KPIs. Here we first started off with a 4-stage, we call it phase 1, in terms of looking at what they currently have at the moment, and then sitting down with them and setting their KPIs. So before the actual workshop, we analyzed what they currently utilize, what the UAE government, federal government utilizes, and we've tried to see what other countries around the globe use to measure their performance. So we took this or the finding from this research in the workshop part, and we sat down with representatives from across different entities in the Ajman government. The main purpose was to select an initial list of KPIs for all of their objectives. Once that was done, we had kind of like a break to allow them to review what they've done, to allow us to try to validate this. And then we had another workshop in which we went through all of the KPIs and created the final list of indicators for all of their objectives. So what we've done is basically select KPIs for all of their objectives, create a scorecard, right? We looked earlier at how a scorecard looks like, objectives plus their KPIs, and very importantly, we've also linked the initiatives of the Ajman government with all of their strategic objectives. I mentioned earlier that we had participants from different entities. So as you can see here, from around 40 different entities, we've tried to get input even if they weren't, let's say, physically present during the workshop. We try to reach out to them and get at least feedback from all of these different areas. Now, something that I wanted to mention, and it's very important, we consider this to be one of the critical parts whenever you are dealing with selecting KPIs, is that you establish a set of criteria that each KPI needs to meet in order for you as either public or private sector organization will select your KPIs upon. So for the Ajman project, we had a set of 6 criteria. First and foremost, we had to make sure that it actually measures. So make sure that it's quantifiable, it measures the objective set. Second, that it's relevant to the objective, but it's also relevant to the Ajman government as it is. Then third, that we have data available for collection, and this was one of the main challenges, that we allow for, let's say, a frequent reporting. So normally, let's say, if you talk about, let's say, government level, the frequency of reporting is normally somewhere around yearly. So we've tried to cut that down to quarterly. Now, why is this important? It's because it allows you to take a look at how you're actually progressing, or if you're not progressing, it allows you to understand where you have, let's say, areas of underperformance, and then intervene at the end of the quarter instead as just seeing at the end of the year that you haven't met your target. And the last 2 parts were alignment to UAE vision. Again, this is linked with what we're going to discuss as our last part of the presentation, importance of alignment, and also alignment to international best practices. We try to see what other countries are trying to measure, how they are measuring this, and also look at the OECD and the World Bank and trying to see how they evaluate country performance. Just as a closeout for this part, this is basically the first result in terms of what was delivered. So we had the set of scorecard plus dashboard at the strategic level. This was complemented by a dashboard considered or consisting of indexes, and these indexes, let's say, some of the main ones were like let's say economic competitiveness, happiness index, which is something that's very important here in the UAE. Just as a, let's say, a comment in brackets, the UAE actually set or established Ministry of Happiness, and it's one of the first countries in the world that have adopted this topic. Now, moving on from the parenthesis, at once we had, let's say, the top level. Then the part was to cascade this around the main strategic pillars, and these were 4: the vibrant and cohesive society, great place to live, green economy, and excellent government. Now, for the last part of our webinar, we're going to talk about the importance of alignment across the public sector. And we've, let's say, touched upon the subject already. You've seen an example of alignment in the example from the Abu Dhabi Pension Fund, as well as our earlier case study from the Ajman Executive Council. Now, normally, how is this done? How do we align, let's say, a country strategy across the entire government? So the example that we have here is from Qatar, and this basically shows what was their process in aligning their main strategic objectives across the different entities. So once we have our, let's say, national values and long-term goals, right, which comprise our national vision, the next step is to identify what are the initiatives that we are going to embark on in order to achieve this vision, right? Now, these national initiatives then are broken down into sector or regional strategies or initiatives in which we define sectoral priorities that are linked with the national development strategy. And ultimately, we link everything down to the ministry and agency level, in which we try to define ministerial plans that support the implementation of sectoral strategies. Now, something that's very important in this part is the fact that as a public sector institution, right, or let's say as a government, either at federal or at local level, it's very important that we have one entity that's responsible for strategy planning and strategy execution. Now, this is key because this entity will basically lead the line in terms of helping us establish the strategy, making sure it is cascaded, and then contributing towards the actual execution part. And here we have a few examples from different countries around the world in which we have this type of singular entity that's responsible for a specific part. So in some countries we have, let's say, the Ministry of Finance. For example, here we have an example from Fiji, where the Ministry of Strategic Planning, National Development and Statistics is responsible for government strategy planning. Let's say more recently, we have the National Center for Performance Measurement, which was established in KSA, and their main role is to make sure that, let's say, the government entities in Saudi Arabia have a clear and aligned approach toward measuring performance. We also have the example of the Council of State in the Netherlands, which does something very similar along the lines of strategy planning for the government in Holland. The parliament has the same role in Denmark. And one, let's say, best practice approach is actually PEMANDU from Malaysia, which is basically a combination between a delivery unit and a performance measurement center. Actually, PEMANDU now helps other government institutions from other countries in applying what they've done in Malaysia. So if you're interested in the topic, PEMANDU is a really interesting case study. Now, moving forward and coming back to the actual cascading part, we talked about the importance of identifying our national vision, right? That national vision would tell us what our development goals, right? Our key, or let's say, group main areas that we want to focus on. Then we break this down into strategic objectives for the local government, and then we start with defining KPIs, which are selected based on the criteria that we discussed. Remember examples from the Ajman case study. Now, once we have the KPI selected, we configure the strategic scorecard, which, remember, is the objectives measured by the KPIs. This is then cascaded down to department or ministry level, in which we then configure scorecards at this level. We try to run, let's say, a verification or an audit of how everything was done to make sure we haven't made mistakes along the way, and assign core capabilities for execution. And this is very much linked with what we discussed earlier in terms of having a government entity that's responsible for this particular part. Right here we have an example from practice this is from Afghanistan, when they've tried, right, because we know Afghanistan is trying to, let's say, recover as a country. So they've formulated the national development strategy, identify objectives, try to measure these objectives through KPIs at state level, and then design a local strategic framework measured again, or let's say objectives measured through KPIs, which were then cascaded down to the ministerial level. One very good example, and something that I like a lot, is the example from the Emirates Identity Authority here in the UAE. So they had, let's call it a corporate strategy, right? So high-level strategy, which they then broke down into a strategy for each department. So linking what the department needs to do, right, to help the entity achieve its objectives, and ultimately they went down to the individual level. So trying to map out how each individual contributes to achieving not just the department objectives, but the corporate objectives as well. And then as you can see here, this is something that's called even, let's say, or helps with bottom-up execution, that people understand how they contribute. This is also called a line of sight, that someone at the individual level understands what's their contribution in achieving a department's or an entity's strategic objectives. Now, lastly, we're going to come back to Saudi Arabia. Right, so I mentioned the National Transformation Program earlier, which is basically linked with the Vision 2030. Now, what they've done is they identify all of the different industries in the Saudi government and link their strategic objectives with the Vision 2030 objectives. So we have here the example from the Ministry of Justice. And so we see on the top part, we have strategic objective, which is linked to the, let's say, see here, relevant Vision 2030 objective. So if you have, let's say, a direct link or a contribution towards reaching the entire government's objectives. Once we have this objective established, the next point is to set up the KPIs. Something, again, that I'd like to, let's say, underline here is the importance of having a baseline. Right, as you can see, not all KPIs have baselines. Some of them are in progress, and that's again something that I'm sure everyone will, let's say, will struggle with, at least in the initial stages, in trying to actually understand or to get the data to allow them to understand where they are at this point in time, because this will be a very important part that will allow us to set what is our target, and that will tell us if we achieve our objectives. Now, that being said, we've reached the conclusion of our last session. I'd just like to take a chance to, let's say, go over the main topics that myself and my colleague Teodora went through together. So remember, it's very important and useful to have a sound strategy planning and communication process. So this strategy planning, as we've seen in the first session, is very important to also link it to something overall, or something that's done at even a higher level, as we had the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But not just that, once we have a sound strategy planning framework set in place, it's important to communicate this strategy to allow our stakeholders to understand what we're actually trying to do. Second, we talked about assessing the maturity level of an entity. This is important because it provides us with an informed view of what's the current state of affairs, and this is important because if we don't understand where we are at this point in time, it's very difficult to draw, let's say, concrete picture of where we plan to go. In terms of building a performance management system, the key tools that we need to take a look at are our strategy maps, scorecards, dashboards. I will add, let's say, here the portfolio of initiatives. So making sure the initiatives, the actions that we're taking are linked with this part as well. In terms of KPI selection, it's very important to establish clear criteria that we're going to utilize, because there will be one of the most useful, let's say, guides in the process of selecting KPIs. And last but not least, we talked about alignment, and this is basically the key step, right? If not, let's say, one of the most important steps that we need to go through in order to make sure that, let's say, our strategy is not just something that's written down on a few sheets of paper, but it's actually transformed into action. Now, that being said, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and we're looking forward to seeing you with any future occasion. Thank you, everyone.
Mihai and Teodora, thank you very much for your presentation. And now We will proceed with our Q&A session, so if you have any queries whatsoever, feel free to address them now. So we have received one question, but it's a bit, it's not very specific. The question is, how do you get started with the materials you have shown here? What are the resources or the sources that should guide someone in the first phases of following the methodology you presented?
Okay, so just to answer the question first, I'm going to scroll back here in terms of, let's say, references. What I would recommend if you're interested in knowing more about, let's say, some of the case studies that or the examples from practice that we've presented. Here we have, let's say, some of the references that we've used. All of them contain links as well, so you can get a chance to review the topics as well. In terms of where do you actually start in terms of, let's say, developing this entire architecture, it depends very much on what is your current situation and in what level of an entity you actually work in. Is it, let's say, state level, federal level, local level? Are you just part of one ministry? So this depends, but just, let's say, as an overall recommendation, it's very important to understand the context that you operate in, regardless if it's federal, state, or, let's say, entity. Understand what is, let's say, the citizens or our stakeholders' expectations and what is our current situation. Based on these two elements, we're going to try to formulate a strategy. Right? And that strategy will tell us what do we need to deliver to our stakeholders. This strategy will then be broken down into objectives, and the objectives show us what do we actually need to achieve. Once we have the objectives, the next step is to select KPIs, and the KPIs will measure the achievement of the objectives, right? So they provide the quantifiable representation of how we are actually performing. And last but not least, once we have the objectives, once we have the KPIs, it's very important to have a set of initiatives or projects that we start. And this basically represents the actions that we are taking to actually achieve the objective. So this would be, let's say, a very condensed overview of what would be the approach that you would need to follow.
All right, thank you very much for your answer. Well, seeing as there seem to be no other questions, I guess that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So Mihai, Teodora, do you have any last words for our listeners?
We'd just like to thank everyone that took their time to join us for our webinar today. We hope that what we've managed to cover will prove useful to everyone, and we're more than happy to let's say to ask any questions or queries that you may have. Even after the webinar finishes, you can get in touch with us via email, and we'll be more than happy to get back to you. And for our, let's say, our attendees from, let's say, this region, I'd just like to wish Ramadan Kareem to everyone.
All right. Well, that is the conclusion of today's presentation. The KPI Institute appreciates your interest in the webinar Managing Performance in the Public Sector Lessons Learned. Follow our websites and our social media channels to find out more details and to subscribe to our next webinar, How to Conduct an Employee Performance Management Audit, which will be held on the 7th of June by Aline Shonda. Also, if you're interested in getting a certification granted by the KPI Institute on vital areas within the performance management discipline, you can explore our scheduled courses on marketplace.kpiinstitute.org. Thank you again for your participation and have a nice day.